Right now, as you are watching this video, American missiles are flying over the Persian Gulf. Iranian drones are targeting United States military bases. Oil prices are higher than they have been in years. Thousands of people are dead. Millions more have been displaced. The entire global economy is holding its breath. And the question that every single person on this planet is asking, from Wall Street traders in New York City to farmers in rural India to factory workers in South Korea, is the same terrifying question. Is this the beginning of World War III? This is not a war from a history book. This is not a conflict from 50 years ago that you are reading about in a classroom. This is happening right now, today, in real time. The United States of America and the Islamic Republic of Iran, two countries that have been enemies for nearly half a century, have finally crossed the line from cold hostility into open, direct, explosive military warfare. And the world will never be the same again. My name is your host on NNC Global News, and today we are going to take you through everything. We are going to explain how this war started, why it started, what has happened since the very first bomb fell, what is happening right now as ceasefire talks collapse and new strikes fly, and most importantly, what this means for you, for America, for the global economy, and for the future of peace in the world. This is the most important story of our generation, and you need to understand it completely. So stay with us, because we are just getting started. Let us go back to the very beginning. To understand why the United States and Iran are at war right now in 2026, you have to understand a relationship that has been broken for nearly 50 years. You have to go back to 1979. That was the year everything changed between Washington and Tehran. Before 1979, the United States and Iran were actually allies. Iran, under its ruler the Shah, was one of America's closest partners in the Middle East. American companies operated in Iran. American advisors trained Iranian military forces. There was real cooperation, real friendship, real strategic alignment between the two countries. Then came the Islamic Revolution. In 1979, a massive popular uprising overthrew the Shah and brought to power the Ayatollah Khomeini, a deeply conservative religious leader who viewed the United States as what he called the Great Satan. The revolution was not just a political change, it was a total civilizational rupture. The new Iranian government was built on a foundation of hostility toward American power and American influence in the Middle East. And then, just months after the revolution, something happened that burned the relationship permanently. Iranian students stormed the American embassy in Tehran and took 52 American diplomats hostage.
For 444 days, those Americans were held prisoner. Iran, for its part, supported militant groups across the Middle East: Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen, various militias in Iraq and Syria, groups that frequently attacked American interests, American allies, and American soldiers. But that deal collapsed when President Trump pulled the United States out of it during his first term in office in 2018. It was, in the view of American and Israeli decision-makers, simply unacceptable. The United States military and the Israeli Air Force had launched a massive coordinated assault on Iran.
The most shocking moment, the moment that sent shockwaves around the entire world, was the assassination of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Khamenei had been the absolute ruler of Iran for more than 3 decades. He was the man who made every major decision about Iran's nuclear program, its support for proxy forces, its foreign policy, everything. And in the opening hours of Operation Epic Fury, American and Israeli forces located him and struck. Khamenei was killed. The man who had called America the Great Satan, the man who had presided over Iran's nuclear ambitions for 30 years, was gone. It was an extraordinary moment, historic, shocking, and deeply consequential. American officials said that regime change had occurred, but they also said, almost immediately, that they did not trust Iran's new leadership. The strikes on the first night targeted Iran's most significant nuclear facilities. The enrichment plant at Natanz, which had been built deep underground specifically to protect it from bombing, was struck by specially designed bunker-busting bombs. The facility at Fordo, also buried under a mountain, was targeted as well. Military air bases across the country were hit. The headquarters of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps was struck. Radar installations and air defense systems were taken out in the opening minutes, so that subsequent waves of aircraft could operate more freely. The scale and precision of the attack was staggering. American military planners had spent years preparing for exactly this scenario, and when the moment came, they executed with devastating effectiveness. But Iran did not sit still. Within hours of the first American and Israeli bombs falling, Iran launched its counteroffensive. And the retaliation was extraordinary in its own right. Iran fired hundreds of ballistic missiles, the most powerful conventional weapons in its arsenal, toward Israel. Many were intercepted by Israel's Iron Dome air defense system and by American warships in the Mediterranean Sea. But not all of them. Some got through. There were explosions in Israeli cities. There were casualties. The Israeli port city of Haifa was struck. Parts of Tel Aviv were hit. Iran also fired missiles at American military bases across the region. Bases in Iraq, in Kuwait, in Bahrain, in Jordan. Some of those missiles got through as well. American soldiers were killed. American equipment was destroyed. Iran also deployed its most powerful strategic weapon. Not a military weapon, but an economic one. The Strait of Hormuz. This narrow waterway, just 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, is the most important choke point for global oil supplies in the entire world. More than 20% of all the oil traded globally flows through the Strait of Hormuz. If that waterway is closed, the consequences for the global economy are catastrophic. And Iran closed it. Iranian naval forces mined the strait. Iranian speedboats harassed tankers. Iranian missiles targeted shipping lanes. Within days of the war beginning, the Strait of Hormuz was effectively shut down, and the global oil market went into absolute shock. The price of oil, which had been trading at around $72 a barrel the day before the war started, shot up dramatically in the days and weeks following the beginning of the conflict. At its peak during the most intense phase of the fighting, prices reached well above $100 a barrel and kept climbing. Every country in the world felt the effects. Gasoline prices at American pumps surged. Electricity bills went up across Europe. In Asia, where countries like Japan, South Korea, India, and China are deeply dependent on oil flowing through the Strait of Hormuz, governments scrambled to find alternative supplies and manage a looming energy crisis. The economic ripple effects of this war spread to every corner of the globe. The fighting in the first weeks of the conflict was intense and terrible. The United States continued to conduct strikes inside Iran, targeting military infrastructure, missile storage facilities, naval vessels, and remaining nuclear-related sites. Iran continued to fire missiles at American bases and at Israel. Hezbollah, the powerful Iran-backed militant group in Lebanon, opened its own front against Israel, firing thousands of rockets from southern Lebanon into northern Israel and forcing massive evacuations of Israeli communities near the border. The conflict had become a multi-front war, with fighting occurring simultaneously in Iran, in Lebanon, in the waters of the Persian Gulf, and in the airspace over multiple Middle Eastern countries. The humanitarian toll began to become clear in the weeks that followed. Inside Iran, the strikes had caused enormous damage to military and nuclear infrastructure, but civilian areas had also been affected. Residential neighborhoods in Tehran and other Iranian cities had been struck, either by American and Israeli bombs that went off course, or by Iranian air defense missiles that failed and fell back to earth. Iranian hospitals struggled to cope with the wounded. The internet inside Iran was shut down by the government to prevent news of the destruction from spreading and to prevent coordination among potential opposition groups. Millions of Iranians were displaced from their homes in the hardest-hit areas. Iran's civilian infrastructure, electricity grids, water systems, transportation networks, was severely damaged. The world watched with a mixture of horror, shock, and deep anxiety. The United Nations Security Council convened emergency sessions, but the United States, as a permanent member with veto power, blocked any resolution demanding a ceasefire. Russia and China, both permanent members with their own veto power, demanded an immediate end to the strikes and condemned the American and Israeli action as a violation of international law. European allies were deeply divided. Some, like Germany and Ukraine, supported the American position that Iran's nuclear program represented a genuine threat that had to be stopped. Others, including France and many other European nations, were horrified by the scale of the military action and called urgently for diplomacy. The Arab world was in a peculiar position. Countries like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates had long viewed Iran as their most dangerous regional rival. They had watched with deep anxiety as Iran expanded its influence across the Middle East through its proxy forces. Part of them, the strategic part, was quietly relieved to see Iran's military capabilities being degraded, but they were also terrified of the regional instability that the war was creating. Iran had targeted their territory with missiles and drones. Kuwait was struck. Infrastructure near UAE airports was targeted. Saudi oil facilities were threatened. These wealthy Gulf states had signed the Abraham Accords and normalized relations with Israel, which now made them targets in Iran's eyes. They wanted the war to end as quickly as possible. Pakistan stepped into the diplomatic vacuum in a way that no one had expected. Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif, navigating the incredibly delicate position of being a Muslim-majority nuclear power with relationships on multiple sides of the conflict, offered to mediate, and against all odds it worked, at least temporarily. In early April 2026, Pakistan brokered a conditional 2-week ceasefire between the United States and Iran. The terms required Iran to agree to temporarily reopen the Strait of Hormuz to commercial shipping. Trump, who had been threatening to bomb Iranian power plants and bridges, warning in one extraordinary social media post that a whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again, agreed to pause the strikes. When the ceasefire was announced on April 8, 2026, the global financial markets reacted with something close to euphoria. Oil prices, which had been trading above $100 a barrel, plunged by more than 15% in a single day. Stock markets around the world surged. For a brief, hopeful moment, it seemed like the worst of the crisis might be over. The Strait of Hormuz was reopening. Negotiations were scheduled to begin in Islamabad. A broader peace deal seemed possible. But the ceasefire was fragile from the very beginning. The fundamental issues that caused the war, Iran's nuclear program, the question of who controls the Strait of Hormuz, the future of Iran's ballistic missile capabilities, Iran's support for proxy forces across the Middle East, none of those issues had been resolved. They had merely been set aside temporarily while diplomats tried to find a way forward. And as the weeks went by, it became increasingly clear that finding that way forward was enormously difficult. The core sticking point in the negotiations was Iran's uranium enrichment program. Iran insisted, absolutely and non-negotiably, that it had the right to enrich uranium for peaceful purposes, to produce fuel for nuclear power plants. This was a right, Iranian negotiators argued, that was recognized under international law. They were willing to accept limits on how much uranium they enriched and to what level, but they were not willing to give up enrichment entirely. The United States, under Trump, took the opposite position. American negotiators demanded that Iran give up uranium enrichment completely, zero enrichment, full stop. The gap between these two positions was enormous. And despite weeks of talks in Doha, in Islamabad, and through various intermediaries, the gap refused to close. There was also the deeply contentious question of the Strait of Hormuz. Iran had proposed in negotiations that the strait be managed jointly by Iran and Oman, a proposal that would give Iran effective control over who could use this critical waterway and under what conditions. Trump rejected this idea instantly and publicly, declaring on social media that no nation will control the Strait of Hormuz. American officials framed this as a fundamental principle, that international waterways must remain free and open for all nations to use. Iranian officials framed it as a matter of national sovereignty over waters adjacent to their territory. This disagreement, too, proved almost impossible to bridge. Throughout May 2026, the fragile ceasefire began to break down in slow motion. Despite the technical truce, both sides found reasons to conduct strikes against each other. The United States said it was conducting self-defense strikes against Iranian drone launch sites and missile batteries that posed threats to American forces and to commercial shipping in and around the Strait of Hormuz. Iran said it was responding to what it called American violations of the ceasefire terms. The line between ceasefire and active conflict became increasingly blurry. Each strike led to counterstrikes. Each accusation led to counter-accusations. The diplomats kept talking, but the weapons kept firing. The situation in Lebanon simultaneously deteriorated dramatically. Israel, frustrated by Hezbollah's constant rocket attacks on northern Israeli communities, launched a massive military operation in southern Lebanon. Israeli forces struck Hezbollah infrastructure across a huge swath of Lebanese territory. Evacuation orders were issued for large areas of Lebanon. At one point, orders covering roughly 14% of the entire country were issued, forcing hundreds of thousands of Lebanese civilians to flee their homes. The human toll in Lebanon was devastating, with civilian casualties mounting every day and the country's already fragile infrastructure pushed to the breaking point. And in Gaza, the war had its own terrible chapter. Despite the broader U.S.-Iran conflict dominating global headlines, Israeli military operations in Gaza continued. Palestinian civilians were killed during what should have been a time of religious celebration, the Eid al-Adha holiday, as Israeli strikes continued even during this period. The images and stories coming out of Gaza added another layer of international outrage and moral horror to an already catastrophic regional situation. Now, as of today, May 29, 2026, the situation remains extraordinarily dangerous and deeply unstable. Just in the past 48 hours, the ceasefire has been shaken to its core once again. American and Iranian forces have traded blows overnight. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps launched an attack targeting an American airbase in Kuwait. The United States military intercepted Iranian ballistic missiles fired toward Kuwait, but the fact that Iran launched those missiles at all is a dramatic and alarming escalation. Meanwhile, the United States conducted its own strikes against Iranian targets, drones and launch sites around the Strait of Hormuz that American officials said posed threats to American forces and to commercial shipping. Both sides are accusing each other of violating the ceasefire. Iran says the Americans struck first and that its missile attack on Kuwait was retaliation. The Americans say Iran's hostile actions forced them to act in self-defense. The truth, as is often the case in war, is somewhere complicated in the middle. What is clear is that a full-scale return to the intense fighting of March and early April remains a very real and frightening possibility. President Trump, meanwhile, is in an extraordinarily complex political and diplomatic position. He has been reviewing the latest version of a potential peace agreement with Iran, but he has not signed off on it. He has signaled that progress is being made in negotiations. He has also signaled that he will not be rushed, and that Iran should not expect to outlast him in a war of diplomatic attrition. Just days ago, Trump said on social media that negotiations with Tehran were proceeding in an orderly and constructive manner, but that he had instructed officials not to rush into a deal, adding that both sides must take their time and get it right. This mixed messaging, hopeful but cautious, engaged but unwilling to make concessions, has made it very difficult for markets, for allied governments, and for ordinary people around the world to know what to expect next. American negotiators have reportedly agreed to a 60-day memorandum of understanding that would extend the ceasefire and begin formal negotiations over Iran's nuclear program. But even this limited step, not a final deal, just an agreement to keep talking, has not yet been formally approved by Trump. American officials told news organizations that the president still needs to sign off, and Trump has shown throughout his political career that he is capable of walking away from deals at the very last moment, especially if he feels he can get better terms by maintaining pressure. The economic consequences of this war are staggering and far-reaching. Let us look at what has happened to oil prices. Before the war began on February 28th, Brent crude oil, the international benchmark, was trading at around $72 per barrel. That was already higher than it had been for much of 2024, reflecting various global tensions and supply constraints. The moment the war started, prices began climbing rapidly. At the peak of the fighting in mid-March, prices reached well above $120 per barrel. The ceasefire in April brought them down somewhat, but they have remained stubbornly elevated, still far above pre-war levels, because the fundamental problem has not been solved. The Strait of Hormuz, while technically open during the ceasefire, is still being used as a bargaining chip. Oil analysts at major banks and research firms are warning that prices could remain elevated, potentially well above $100 per barrel, for the foreseeable future. Some analysts are saying that even if a permanent peace deal is reached, it could take a year or more for prices to return to pre-war levels, because the war has taken 10 to 11 million barrels of crude oil per day offline, and the inventory that has been drawn down to compensate will need to be replenished, which will keep demand, and therefore prices, high. The impact on ordinary American families has been significant. Gasoline prices at the pump are higher than they have been in years. Heating bills are elevated. The cost of shipping goods, which affects the price of almost everything that Americans buy, has gone up. Airlines, which depend on jet fuel, have raised ticket prices. These are the quiet, everyday costs of a war that is happening thousands of miles away from American soil, but that reaches into every American household through the price of gasoline and the cost of goods. The impact on global markets has been enormous. Japan's stock market had a wild ride, surging dramatically at moments when peace seemed close, then falling back when the ceasefire appeared to be collapsing. South Korea, which imports nearly all of its oil and is deeply dependent on the Strait of Hormuz remaining open, scrambled to secure alternative supplies. India, whose rapidly growing economy consumes enormous quantities of energy, saw its import costs soar. China, which is the world's largest importer of oil and gets a substantial portion of its supply from the Persian Gulf, was furious at the disruption and increased diplomatic pressure on all sides to reach a settlement. The war created economic pain across every continent. There is also a deeper question that this war raises about the future of American power and American strategy in the Middle East. The United States has been trying for many years to reduce its military footprint in the region. The rise of shale oil production in America reduced the country's dependence on Middle Eastern oil. The public, exhausted by the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, had little appetite for new Middle Eastern conflicts. And yet here we are. American forces are once again at the center of a major Middle Eastern military confrontation, with American blood being shed and American treasure being spent. Supporters of the American decision to go to war argue that the alternative was worse. They say that a nuclear-armed Iran would have been the most dangerous development in the modern history of the Middle East. They argue that Iran's nuclear program, left unchecked, would have triggered a nuclear arms race across the region, with unpredictable and potentially catastrophic consequences. They point out that Iran had refused to negotiate seriously, that diplomacy had been tried and had failed, and that military action was the only remaining option to prevent an outcome that would have endangered millions of people for decades to come.